Thank you very much for joining us today. I have asked 2 volunteers, so basically I volunteered them to come and join me up on stage for a minute here. Peter and Alex are going to come and stand here. I can't do mic and clicker. How do I do this thing? Okay, so yeah, you can come stand. Alex is going to be our strategic leadership. Peter, sorry. So you get the ball. Okay. You can pass to your teammate here. She's our programs team. So you can pass a task across to her. Please go ahead and do that. Yeah, well, you can throw it. Yeah. Okay, there's a work plan for you. When you finish that task, will you pass it back to Peter, please? Okay, so there's a strategy. Oh, hang on, there's another one for you to do. Okay, wait a minute, there's one here for you. Don't drop the balls! Don't drop the balls! Okay, would it help? Would it help if I stood here in the middle and you put them in a bucket and then you can get them out the bucket? No, and then you can put yours back in the bucket. And you can get them out the bucket. Okay, does that help? So you can put them in and out the bucket like that. And this is how we pass the tasks from one to each other. That's much easier, right? No balls dropped. Great, guys. Thank you. You've been absolute stars. Round of a hand for our amazing volunteers. We'll collect all the balls later. That's great. So what is growth as a non-profit organization? What do we mean when we talk about growth? So we have a couple of common metrics when we talk about growth in general. We say things like your annual budget, your number of staff, number of beneficiaries, maybe your geographic reach that has grown, your diversity in funding, and a very common one, the exhaustion of the board. How many meetings are there? No more change. Don't want to know something else is going on. We are good. Thank you very much. A lot of growth models plot a expected trajectory that is a continuous growth model, something a bit like that, right? However, in a non-profit world, it is not really the reality. Most of the time, growth looks a bit like that. Okay, well, hopefully on a generally upward trend, but there are years where funding is abundant, there are years where funding is tight. Many organizations are struggling with planning for next year given the Swedish foreign aid decisions and uncertainty there. With 80% of the world held in elections this year, the political uncertainty has an impact on the organizations in ways we can't predict. So all in all, growth normally feels like this, right? The reality for nonprofits is that nothing is certain. It is always changing. That's our norm. And so we have to identify and hold on to the core of what makes us nonprofit organizations, despite the fluctuations in the world that we live in. So we have a donut model. Later on, I'm going to share with you our hamburger model. And it's no surprise that we like food in our company. We have a few of those, and I'm kind of working on a milkshake model at some point. We'll see. But this is our donut model. Okay. And it looks like this when you unpack it. The core of the donut, the core of the organization is the mission, the vision, the organizational culture, your values, the gooey center that makes you who you are as an organization. The engine room are the things that you have developed unique to you over time. So things like your core methodologies, your intellectual property. Maybe it is key financial processes that you have in place. It's your workbooks, your manuals, your operating systems, your procedures, the way that you do things. It's how you as an organization operate. And then the last circle are your activities, your workshops, your programs, your projects, your research papers, the things that you do. It's what you do as an organization. It's what you've committed to in your grant agreements. It's the deliverables that you give as an organization. And this is really what growth looks like as an organization. Is when our activities expand and contract depending on funding, but our engine room and our core remains the same. Okay. At some point, if your outside circle continues to expand and you find that that becomes quite a stable trajectory, there's a point in time where your engine room needs to expand to balance the donut. Otherwise, it's very lopsided donut. Needs to have equal spacing in those things. And that's a critical point for any organization. Okay. So we like to look at it a different way. This side here. Okay. So let's pretend you're a small organization and you have just started up. You are trying to work out who you are, what you do. You are fighting fires and chasing your tail and retrospectively putting in place systems and procedures. You're basically surviving. You're here on this graph, right? Startup, you're just hanging in there. Once you have passionate employees in place, once you have efficient processes in place, once you have committed donors, then you start to actually have a good foundation to begin to strive. And you move up this way. A striving organization builds on those firm foundations by proving their business model, by establishing their theory of change. We heard about that earlier on, actually having that evidence that shows that they are making an impact. At that point, hopefully they have innovative leadership who is starting to develop a clear strategy for the next phase, which is the thriving, right? At that point, an organization shifts from focusing internally and internal processes and systems towards external, towards greater level of impact. A thriving organization, no matter what the size, will look at how do we give back. Now that we know what we do works really well, how do we support other people to expand our reach? How do we look at our ecosystem and see what is before us and what is after us in that process of change that we can get involved in? The thriving organization starts looking at partnerships and collaboration for a much greater impact. Okay. But as you're growing, however you define that, at some point, almost unnoticed, some things will stop working. Things won't be as smooth as they used to be. Things just start to fall apart a little bit. You've reached the tipping point. At that tipping point, and you'll see it's not a graph that goes like this because there's no clear defined point where that is. But you'll start to notice what we call the stone in the shoe. Okay, and we did have a picture we took out of a high heel shoe, and you can just imagine as you're walking along, there's a little niggle. This thing isn't right. Something's not quite working because you've reached the tipping point where you are no longer the organization you were. You're now something different. You're bigger. You're stronger. You have a different look to you. Maybe an example I found quite common is you've got new donor funding. Recent one is GIZ funding. Show of hands, anybody have GIZ funding? Wow, you are a lucky bunch. Okay. Great funders, but they are very, very particular about procurement processes and all the checks and balances and it's paperwork hell, basically. So when you're a small organization, you're getting bits and pieces of money from more generic donors, You're not having the systems in place to be able to manage something like a GIZ funder. But once you've grown to the point that GIZ will fund you, you now have to have those things in place, and you've entered into a new world. You've crossed that threshold in your growth. Okay. And at that point, you are no longer a thriving organization. You actually go back to the beginning and start as a surviving organization that looks different. It's a different organization in a surviving stage. You build your foundations, you re-look at what that looks like, and you move up there. Many organizations will stay in one of these towers and never get to that point, or they'll get to the middle and never get to the next one, right? That depends on you and whether you're prepared for that and whether you want to go past thriving into the next phase as an organization. Okay, so you have to set the right staff in the right places, update processes, grease the engine, right? That engine room, because the engine room here looks very different from the engine room there. Grease that engine room for the new organization that you are and not the one you were a few years ago. So I promised you a hamburger model. There she is. Right? We have a number of hamburger pictures that we use for the hamburger model. This one is not my favorite. It is too much green stuff. The previous one was like oozing and juicy and dripping, and I was like, that's great. This is a healthy burger. And I suppose it's appropriate because we really want to talk about healthy organizations. So we can live with having a healthy hamburger for you to look at. All right. So this is what the model looks like in a graphic form. Don't worry, it doesn't look like that. I will open it up. Okay. So the model describes the functioning of a nonprofit organization. All right. It has two parts to it. It has the operational culture and the organizational culture. Okay, so that's the model in its glory, right? So we talk about having organizational culture and operational culture led by the strategic leadership and the operational leadership teams. And some of you go, yeah, that's very funny. It's me, myself, and I. It's the two of us. What do you mean teams? This is a little bit much for me. But there are very specific mindsets and ways of thinking. And even if you are a one-man show, it's very helpful to see decisions and see thought processes from those two perspectives. I have a friend who runs a nonprofit organization north of Pretoria, and he has two chairs. So when he's doing admin and things like that, and he's very operational, he sits at his desk in front of the computer and he does his stuff. But when he has to think big about the organization and where they're going, he sits in his thinking chair. He has like a comfy chair that he actually physically gets up and he goes and sits in his chair. So even if that's what it means to you as an individual, having the perspective of the two sides is very important. I've got too many hands here. I can't even get to my water. Okay. So I'm going to go through on the top and the bottom quite quickly because I want to get to the patty and my favorite part, which is the cheese. The cheese. Okay. So the top of a hamburger is the strategic leadership. Strategic leadership is responsible for the ideation. They're responsible for thinking through who we are as an organization. They're responsible for going, why do we exist? What is our purpose? Have we fulfilled our purpose? Has our purpose changed? They're asking the question, why, and defining the vision for the organization. The strategic leadership is also responsible for the culture of the organization, whether that be intentional or unintentional sometimes. They need to bring that all together. And they also answer the question of how are we as an organization going to make a difference. They set with the strategy, they define the direction of the organization, right? They're responsible for the ideation. So that is your strategic leadership. Your operational leadership is responsible for taking that strategy and breaking it down into its outcomes. How are we actually going to do what strategic leadership has determined we should be doing? What are the policies and procedures that explain to us how we do things, how we don't do things, what we do, what we don't do? What is the step-by-step way of working? How is it that we actually make that strategy a reality? That's your operational leadership, where it's actually looking at turning the vision into something practical and tangible. So what we find is that even if you are wearing more than one hat and you're sitting across both of those aspects, people tend to be wired towards one or the other. You know, we say to people, oh, you're a visionary. You can't get anything practically done. Or you're so stuck in the detail you can't see the big picture, right? That's a reality. We all have personalities, we all have preferences, we all have ways of working that align with one or other of those sort of areas. And that's why it's so important to have team, to bring the other perspective to the conversation. And team doesn't need to be staff. Team could be a mentor relationship, an outside consultant. It could even be a community such as this one, where you're looking for input and a sounding board from somebody who brings a different perspective to the conversation. Okay. But neither of these work in isolation to each other. They are integrally involved and connected. Okay, so they sit here. The operational leadership responsible for implementation and strategic for the ideation. In a previous version of the model, we actually had a circle in the middle with some arrows going up and down, because you need to have that feedback loop. When strategy is determined by the strategic leadership and operations go, yeah, that ain't happening. That's not possible. How on earth do you think we're going to get into that many regions with a practical, right? There needs to be that communication loop. But at the same time, strategy needs to hear and say, okay, taking the practical into, one of the big things is the political environments that we work in. And where you look at violence and you look at people being discriminated against and being unsafe. Some of those areas to work in are really practically difficult. That needs to be taken into account in the strategy. And so you have this communication loop, this feedback that happens between the strategic and the operational leadership. And so what holds it all together is my favorite part, the sticky cheese. Cheese of communication, right? The cheese that gets everywhere and just, you know, you can't take the cheese off a hamburger. It's like into everything. It glues it all together, right? That's the best part about communication. Okay, so let us spend a minute here. I'm not sure I need that, but I talk with my hands. This is very restrictive. Okay, so the two halves of the communication of the hamburger can represent any two parts of an organization. So maybe you have the board at the one side and the organization at the other. There needs to be communication between all of those. Maybe you have different branches. What is your communication cheese that's gluing all of those together? What about programs and admin and finance? That's the most disconnected groups within most organizations. There's very little cheese in between them, primarily because they don't speak the same language typically. So you end up with nacho sauce at the top and cheese at the bottom, right? It's not quite the same thing, but it is sort of, right? So anywhere that you have instructions, communication, work plans, deliverables that need to be communicated across two groups, you need to have a communication bucket. Okay? So a communication bucket comes in various shapes and sizes. So this one looks like this. But let me give you some practical examples from actual organizations. One of my clients has what they call First Thursdays, which is a meeting on, and you guessed it? Exactly. We're all Cape Townians, we know what that means. Historically, the programs team would regularly meet and they would have their planning and they would do their thing and then they'd travel because they do a lot of work around the world. And then admin and finance, particularly their logistics team, were always on the back foot going, where are you going? What's the budget line for this? What's the code for that? Can't get meetings because people are traveling. There was this disconnect and they really felt sort of out of the loop. And so now First Thursdays is a collective meeting across the organization where they review the past month and what worked and what didn't work, and they look forward into the future month so that finance and admin know what's going on, even if they're not necessarily directly involved. And recently, this bore enormous fruit. So the finance controller was sitting with the program manager and looking at the report, the monthly report for that particular program. And there were errors everywhere, inaccurate allocations of expenditure. So the budget variance was skewed. And it's incredibly frustrating for the finance person because she's like, the bookkeeper's not making mistakes. He's not typing stuff in wrong. The information that's provided to us by the programs team is wrong. We're putting it in, and now when you look at the end result, it looks wrong. So they realized that there was a misunderstanding of the programs team in how they classified something. Not that they're doing it wrong, they just didn't understand the implications of it. So they took it to the First Thursdays, and we explained how the report looks, what the end picture looks like, how it all impacts, and they problem solved together, and they came up with one tiny little change. On the list of initial instructions at the time of planning the workshop, they added one more question. And when the programs team fill in those questions at the time of planning, it's now accurately captured all the way through the system. Now that kind of solution isn't possible to have when you're in silos and there's no mechanism for communicating across the organization and for finding solutions that aren't a situation where finance is saying you have to fill in this another form. Enough with the forms. Another example is a client who uses what they call the Gantt. Okay? Now, it's not actually a Gantt chart. It's really more a work plan. But it captures all of the activities that they have committed to their donors to do in the course of the year. That's normal programmatic planning. But what they've done is they've added the donor, they've added the budget line, and they've added the budget amount, so that they have all the information they need to communicate effectively with finance about where this expenditure is going, and finance have all the information to know what's happening. So the finance manager used the tool very effectively recently when she had to do a report to the donor. And it comes up with a budget variance. And she's like, but we should have spent this money. Opens up Gantt, has a look at the activities, and sees that 3 of the activities are only scheduled for the second half of the year. Well, there you go. She types it in there. That explains the variance because she now knows what the program people know. And the program people know what she knows. And that communication bucket for them was very effective in solving and answering the questions that she has. So everybody there is always like, have you checked the Gantt? Have you checked the Gantt? It's like the buzzword. Another common bucket that people use is home days, home weeks. Program people come in, you learn from each other, you have a conversation. But often admin, finance, operational team aren't involved in those meetings. Maybe that's something that could be expanded to think about what kind of bucket is necessary for the communication. So in order for you to effectively transition across that tipping point where what was working is no longer working, you need an effective communication bucket that will help you to collaboratively problem solve and actually build systems and structures for the organization that you are going to be and not the organization you were. And the sooner you realize that there's a stone in your shoe, the sooner you can start to build those systems through your communication so that you don't end up starting right at the bottom and chasing your tail, fighting fires, trying to fix what is now completely broken. And so I just want to leave that with you to say, where is your organization? How much movement have you had? What's no longer working? What's a little bug for you? What communication mechanism have you put in place to help problem solve and fix those things so that you can continue to grow into a thriving organization? Okay, thank you very much. This is me. Ilse has a form at the back there if you want to put your name down and I'll get hold of you. If you want to come and chat, because Annie's going to talk now, so I can connect with you at a later date. Okay.